Hi everybody, I am Mr. Pete McLeod and I want to share a story today with you. And this story is about a boy. His name was Hank, and two people that liked him very, very much. They were his neighbors. Their names were Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Now the title of my story is Hank and Mr. and Mrs. Smith. I made up the story all by myself. Thank you. I would like to introduce Hank to you at this time. This is Hank. Maybe you've met him before. Hank lived next door to Mr. and Mrs. Smith, and every week, Mr. and Mrs. Smith would say, "Hank, why don't you come to church with us?" And he would say, "No, thank you, I'd rather not." Well, that made Mr. and Mrs. Smith very sad. But they continued to ask him to come to church because they wanted him to come and meet other boys and girls and also learn about Jesus. So, and the next week they'd say, "Hank, why don't you come to church with us?" And he would say, "No, thank you." Hank thought that anybody that went to church was just a great big square. Just a great big square. Well, they still kept after Hank day after day, but Hank thought he would rather stay at home and think about church rather than go to church and think about being home in bed. I know a lot of other people that have that same kind of thought. And every week, if you were to drive by Hank's house on your way to church and you looked up into his bedroom window, you would see Hank up there sound asleep in his sleeping bag. Wow. Well, let me introduce Mr. and Mrs. Smith to you. This is Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Every week they'd say, "Hank, why don't you come to church with us?" And Hank would say, "No, thank you, I'd rather not." It made Mr. and Mrs. Smith very sad. In fact, it made them downright blue. But they decided to pray for their neighbor Hank. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tie these two big handkerchiefs together. And the main reason I tie them together is because it's impossible to tie them apart. Well, day after day, week after week went by. And every week, Mr. and Mrs. Smith would invite Hank to come to church with them. And he would say, "No, I'd rather stay at home and be in bed." But you know what? One day something amazing happened. If you were to drive by Hank's house and you look up into his bedroom window, you would see that Hank wasn't there. He was gone. Where do you think he went? Of course, he was in church. But not only in church, he was sitting right between Mr. and Mrs. Smith. It pays to pray for your neighbors, that's for sure.